Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Samach Aleph contains one Mishnah. From the beginning of the daf until the Mishnah is finishing off a comparison about two psulim of a carbon Pesach. That's a psul if you had in mind for the wrong carbon or if you had in mind for the wrong owner. Which one of those is stronger, and which one of those can affect greater repercussions in the carbon. Then we'll get to our next Mishnah, which discusses other types of psulim, specifically if you had in mind that the carbon will be for someone who can't eat it. The Gemara will discuss how that psul plays out, which avodos it refers to, and what if it's shared between people who could eat it and can't eat it. So first of all, we have seen the Gemara is discussing a situation in which psulim are a good thing and not psulim are a bad thing. That's if you bring the carbon Pesach not on Erev Pesach, it's the wrong time. So if you're bringing it as a kosher carbon Pesach, then it's puzzle because it's not the right time. If, however, it's puzzle to be a carbon Pesach, then it's a kosher carbon because it's a shlamim, not a Pesach. And the Gemara is discussing what type of psul is a good enough psul to make the Pesach puzzle and therefore the shlamim kosher. The carbon is kosher as the shlamim. The Gemara is comparing the two psulim of shachting it for the wrong intention, where you didn't shacht it as carbon Pesach at all. That's definitely a good enough psul to ruin it from being a Pesach, and therefore it's kosher if it's not on Erev Pesach like it's supposed to be. The Gemara wants to know, what if you did it for the wrong person? You had in mind the wrong person, not the correct owner. Now, generally, the halacha with carbon shachted for the wrong person is that it's not a psul for the carbon. It doesn't work for the person that brought it because you didn't have him in mind when you shachted it, but the carbon's okay, and you can keep using it. You can finish the avoda. However, a carbon Pesach is different, and that's because the owner has to bring it and he has to eat it. And if you have in mind somebody else, then he can't eat it, and therefore you mess the carbon up. That's generally the rule. The question here is that psul of wrong owner enough to make it not kosher as a Pesach, and therefore if it's in the wrong time, it's not canceled because of that, and you can still use it as a shlamim. So the Gemara wants to say, yes, it should. Why not? If it's Erev Pesach, it's a psul, just like if it's the wrong type of carbon kavana, it's a psul. So those are two psulim on Erev Pesach. They should also count, both of them, both the psul of having in mind the wrong type of carbon and the wrong owner. Both those psulim should be good enough to make the carbon not acceptable as a carbon Pesach, and if it's the wrong time, it should be kosher. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. It could be that only the psul of the wrong type of carbon, that takes it out of the category of a carbon Pesach and is machshir if it's the wrong time, because that's an extra strong psul. In 4 ways, it's stronger than the psul of the wrong owner. What are the 4 ways? So Gemara says, first of all, it's a psul in the guf, in the animal itself. Second of all, it's a psul that in most karbanos applies in all 4 avodas. If you have in mind the wrong type of a carbon in any of the 4 main avodas of shchita, holacha, kabbalah, and zrika, if you have in mind in any of them, it passes the carbon. But having in mind the wrong person only passes in zrika in most kamanas. That's because, as Rashi explains, zrika is what's supposed to actually do the kapara. It's supposed to affect the atonement for the owner. So that's the essential avodah that has to be done l'shem the right owner. If it's wrong, then it messes it up for him. But the other 3 don't make a difference for him. From Pesach, it's also psul in all 4 avodas, but we still see that the psul of wrong carbon is worse than the psul of wrong person, because in the other karbanos it applies in all, as opposed to wrong person, which only applies in zrika. The third way in which the psul of wrong carbon is worse is that it applies even if the owner has died and his inheritor has taken over the carbon. So if it's wrong carbon, that applies. If it's, however, wrong person, that doesn't apply because it's not the original person anyway. And the fourth way is that if it's a carbon tzibur, a congregational carbon, which is brought for everybody, for the entire congregation, then if it's the wrong carbon that the Kohen had in mind, you messed it up. If it's the wrong person, of course, he didn't have in mind because it was supposed to be for the whole congregation. So if it's for the wrong person, it's still including the right person, which was the entire congregation. So the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says, this you're telling me that these are 4 ways in which wrong carbon is a stronger psul than wrong person, that not all 4 of these are true. Only 2 of them are true. The 2 that we're taking out is it saying that wrong carbon is stronger because it's a psul begufa. Wrong carbon just means you had in mind at the time of shchita or avoda that it's a different carbon than it's meant to be. That's not a psul in the guf of the animal itself. That's a psul of the intent that the performer, the kohen, had in mind. It's not called a psul in the guf. And as far as the inheritor, after he died, so it's only it's a machlokes as to whether that's true. According to Rav Pinchas Beider Rav Ami, even after the person has died and it's been inherited by someone else, there is still a psul of a wrong owner. So that psul is just as strong. It applies achar misa, it applies after the death of the owner, just like wrong carbon applies. So these two factors are taken out, but we still do have the other two factors. So we do show then that at least with the other two factors, that the psul of wrong carbon is worse than the psul of wrong owner, and therefore the psul of wrong carbon can cancel its status as a kosher carbon Pesach, and therefore that can make it kosher as a shlamim if it's not the right time for a carbon Pesach, but the psul of wrong owner can't necessarily do that. And the Gemara concludes, Rava says, the psul of wrong owner does not do that. The psul of wrong owner just makes it have the status of a carbon Pesach, which is brought for the wrong owner, which is a pasul carbon. Even if it's the wrong time, it's still a carbon Pesach, which is a pasul carbon. If it would be a pasul carbon Pesach entirely and mess up its status as Pesach altogether, it would revert to being a shlamim, and then it would be kosher because it's not Erev Pesach. But this psul is not big enough to do that, and instead it stays a carbon Pesach that's done the wrong time, and it also has an additional psul that is done for the wrong owner, but it's still qualified as a carbon Pesach itself. This ends the Gemara. Now we start the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens when you shech the carbon Pesach for the wrong people designated to eat it. The halacha is that the eating is an essential part of the carbon Pesach, not like most karbanos, where you just have to bring the carbon. It's not necessarily a mitzvah for the owners to eat or for anybody to eat it. It doesn't mess up the carbon if nobody eats it. Carbon Pesach is brought to be eaten. That's part of the mitzvah. If you bring a carbon Pesach and there is nobody that can eat it because you've brought it wrongly, as far as the eaters are concerned, you've messed up the Korban Pesach and it's pasul. And so the Mishnah lists 4 types of situations in which you had the wrong eaters in mind, and therefore the Korban Pesach is pasul because of your wrong intent. You had intent for certain people to eat it, and they can't eat it. There's nobody qualified to eat it. So that's as follows. If the carbon Pesach had one chabura, one group registered to it, those are the only people that are allowed to eat it, but then you shecht it with intent that a different group should eat it, then nobody can eat it, because the group that's registered to it can't eat it, you didn't have them in mind. That's pasul. If you shechted it, or you did any of the avodas, in fact, for people who don't have a bris milah, even if they legally don't have a bris milah because it's considered to be a danger for them, they still can't eat the carbon Pesach. The Torah says, Kol lo yochal bo, and therefore there's no qualified eaters for this carbon, and it's pasul. Same thing applies if the people you had it in mind are tamei. Carbon Pesach can't be eaten by tamei people. All these are psulim. Now the Mishnah says, what happens if you had a group of people in mind? Some of them can eat it, and some of them cannot eat it. Like, for example, some of the people are included in the registration and some are not. You had in mind for some people which are included and some are not. Or some have a bris milah and some do not. Some are tamei and some are tahar. So the halacha is it's kosher. As long as some of the people can eat it, that's okay. You just need one concise of this carbon to be eaten for the entire carbon to be kosher and worthwhile. Now, some other halachas about a psulim of a carbon Pesach. It was shechted before chatzos, before midday, it's pasul, because it's got to be bein ha'arbayim, which is in the afternoon. It was shechted before the carbon tamid of the afternoon. It's not supposed to, but it's still kosher. But you're not supposed to put the blood on the mizbeach until after the blood of the carbon tamid is put on, and therefore you should have somebody standing and mixing the blood to make sure it doesn't congeal. If, however, you do put the blood on before the carbon tamid, it's still kosher, even though you did another thing you're not supposed to do. Okay, the Gemara now begins. It brings a brisa which identifies more specifically the first 2 psulim in the Mishnah, and it gives their sources. That is the source that it's not the right thing to do, and that if you do it, there is a psul involved. So first of all, the 2 things that it said was for the right eaters and the wrong eaters, or for the wrong eaters is the first psul, and for the wrong group, the wrong registrants, is the second psul. So the Gemara describes what does it mean the wrong eaters. The Gemara says if the people that you shechted it for can't eat the Karban Pesach because they're too old or too sick, even if they are registered, if those are the only people that you shechted it for, nobody can eat it then, and that would be a psul. Second psul is, like we said, if it's for the people which aren't registered and only the people which aren't registered, like one group registered and you shechted it for a different group. It says Gemara, what's the source of these two psulim? So Gemara says it's from the pasuk that says, describing it, it says, b'michsas nefashos, ish lefi achlei techaisu alaseb. B'michsas nefashos, it has to be b'michsas nefashos. The Gemara translates the word b'michsas means the registrants, the people that are registered to it, they have to be the one to do it, and it's linked to achila because it's to the eating. It says ish lefi achlei techaisu alaseb. You also need to have people able to eat it. Those two things both have to happen. Now, how do you know that because these things have to happen, that means if you don't do it, it's puzzle? Maybe that's how you're supposed to do it, but if you don't, it's not a psul, it's still kosher. So Gemara says no, because if you look carefully at the words, it shows you that. Where do you see that? So there's two versions of this. One is that it says b'michsas nefashos ish lefi achlei techaisu. It repeats b'michsas techaisu. The repetition is to tell you that it's no good if you don't do it. And the second shot is the second word of techaisu is actually Aramaic. Techaisu means to cut or to slaughter in Aramaic, in Yerushalmi Aramaic. So the pasuk is saying that it's b'michsas nefashos with reference to the people. Techaisu also, that's how you have to do the shechita. The shechita has to be done with the proper registrants, otherwise it's not a valid shechita at all. And again, this is linked both to the registrants and to the people that are actually able to chew it and eat it, because those two are linked together. It says lefi achlei techaisu. The Gemara now asks another shaila, makes it a machlokes Rabban or Chizda, and launches into a long discussion to try to resolve it. The shaila is as follows: what happens if somebody shechts the Karban Pesach correctly, properly, with the right intention for qualified people who can eat it, but with that kavanah, he has in mind that the zrika, the application of the blood to the mizbeach, that's going to be done for puzzle people. At the time of the shechita, he has in mind the shechita is for the right people, but I'm planning to do the zrika with intent that that zrika should be for the wrong people. Is that a psul or not? Rav Chizda says it's a psul. Zrika for the wrong person passes the Karban Pesach, and having that in mind at the time of shechita also passes the Karban Pesach, it passes it from that shechita. Rabbah says no. Zrika for the wrong person, intending to do zrika for the wrong person, does not passel the Karban at all. Now the Gemara is going to try to resolve this machlokes. Is zrika intent to do zrika for the wrong person a psul or not? In order to do this, we're going to bring a brisa which goes into a totally different discussion. It's going to wind back around as far as understanding the brisa. It's going to end up saying that shechita is a psul and zrika isn't. Zrika is different than shechita. According to Rabbah, zrika is different than shechita will be because zrika, having intent to do zrika for the wrong person, is not a psul at all. According to Rav Chizda, it'll be that it is a psul, but it's stricter than shechita. Either way, it's different. The question is it more lenient or is it stricter? What's the discussion? So the brisa is discussing what happens if you do shechita for a mixed group, and some of them do not have a bris milah. You have an oral in there. Does the fact that he's mixed in there disqualify the other people in the group as well? Does it passel the entire Karban for the entire group? And we've seen in our Mishnah that it does not. But here we're going to try to figure out why. So the brisa says you may think that it should pass that having an oral, having somebody who doesn't have a bris milah, including the people that the Karban was done for, should passel the whole group. Let's try to figure out whether it's true or not. So look at it this way. The Karban Pesach has a lot of kazesim in there. Some of those kazesim will be eaten by the oral, by the person who doesn't have a bris milah. Does that passel all the kazesim? So the Gemara says, let's compare it to two other psulim. One passels other kazesim, and one doesn't passel other kazesim. What are the two? Let's say one of the person eating a kazais is a tameh. So we know, the Gemara doesn't explain how, but the Gemara says that the kazesim being eaten by the tummy doesn't passel the other kazesim for the other people. On the other hand, if one of those kazesim you have intent at the time of shechita to eat it in the wrong place or in the wrong time, you have it. Let's stick with chutzlas mane so that it's pigul. You have intent to eat that kazayis in the wrong time. That psul will passel the entire Karban and all the other kazayis in it. That means at the time of shechita, you have in mind that one kazayis of this Karban will be eaten in the wrong time. It'll be eaten, let's say, on the third day of Pesach. So that's the wrong time. That makes the entire Karban pigul. The entire Karban is passel. All other kazayis involved in the Karban are passel because of that one kazayis that you had in mind at the time of shechita is going to be eaten in the wrong time. So the question is, where does Mila fit in? If one of the Kazesim you have in mind that one of those Kazesim is going to go to a person who doesn't have a bris Mila, is it like Tuma and it doesn't passel the rest of the carbon, or is it like wrong time and it does passel the rest of the carbon? So the Gemara says, well, let's see what it's more similar to. So the Gemara says, on the one hand, Mila, not having a Mila, is very similar to Tuma. Why? In the sense that both of them only apply to a carbon Pesach. There's no psal of Mila or Tuma in other Kabbanas. Other Kabbanas, you can have a Tameh or a person without a Mila included in the Kavana. On the other hand, though, Kazayas being eaten by someone without a bris Mila is more similar to Kazayas that's you have intent to eat it in the wrong time. Why is that? Because there's no heter for any of those. There's no situation in which it's okay to eat a carbon Pesach without a bris Mila or to have any carbon eaten in the wrong time. There are times, though, that it is kosher to be eaten betuma, and that's if most people are tameh, that we say tumah hutra betzibur. So we're stuck. We don't know whether psal of having a lack of bris Mila should be more compared to tumah or to wrong time. So the Gemara says we have the Brisa, we have a derivation from a pasuk that solves a problem. The psal of Mila doesn't passel the other kezesim; it only passels that person who can't eat it. What's the proof? Because the pasuk says, "V'yom Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron zos chukas haPesach." This is the rule of the Pesach. So that proves that the carbon is kosher, even if one kezayas or two is going to be eaten. You have intended it should be eaten by somebody without a bris Mila. So Gemara says, what does have to do with anything? What is zos chukas haPesach? How does that teach you that? So the Gemara therefore says, both Rabbi and Rav Chizda agree so far that what's happening here is this: we're really learning from a different pasuk. We're learning from the pasuk that says, V'chol aral lo yachal bai. All arelim shouldn't eat it. And the zais is just to tell me that this rule of all arelim shouldn't eat it only applies to the shchita, and doesn't apply to the zrika. It says zais chukas Pesach. This is the rule. This the shchita of the Pesach. That's where you have a special rule of v'chol ben echer lo yachal bai. But when it comes to other avodos like the zrika, there's no such rule. The zrika is left out. Now, what are we learning from V'chol Orel? So Rabbi says we're learning that only a Orel, that it's only when it's V'chol Orel, it's only when the entire carbon is set to be eaten by people without a bris Mila, that's when there's a psol. It's only when it's V'chol Orel. A whole thing is for Arelim. If, however, part of it is for Arelim, part of it is not, the carbon's good. Now, you may think that that's true by Zrika also. That's why it says Zos Chukas Pesach, this rule of V'chol only applies to a carbon Pesach. But Zrika has no psul whatsoever. Zrika, you can have in mind that it's all for Milim, it's all for Arelim, it's all for people who don't have a bris Mila. You have that in mind in the Zrika, that's fine. So says Rabbah, this is a proof to me that if you have in mind at the time of Shechita that you're going to do the Zrika for the wrong people, there's no problem. Zrika doesn't have a psal, even if every single person you have in mind that you're going to do Zrika for is going to be Arel, it's not a psal. Says Rav Chizda, you got it all right except for the last step. Zrika is different than Shechita, because Zrika doesn't have a V'chol, but not because Zrika has no psal whatsoever, and you're allowed to have anybody who's a psal. You're allowed to have the entire thing be set aside for Arelim. Zrika is different because Zrika, there is a psal of having it set aside for the wrong people, and even if only a couple of people involved are Arelim, have no bris Mila, and the Zrika is partially for them, that's still a psal for the entire thing. So Zrika is worse. So again, there are three levels. Rabbi and Rav Chizda are both agreeing that the Shechita is only a problem if it's done for all Arelim, all people that are no good. Rabbah says that Zrika is lighter than that, and even if all the people that the Zrika is done for are Arelim, it's still good. And Chizda says no, Zrika is worse than that. Zrika, even if only part of the people that the Zrika is that you had in mind the Zrika for are Arelim, it's still a psal. Now, according to Rabbah, Zrika is lighter, more lenient than Shechita. Says Rabbah, how do you know that Zrika is lighter than Shechita? Says Rabbah, very simply, I'll show you another way in which Zrika is lighter than Shechita, because there is no psal of wrong eaters in Zrika. If you had in mind wrong eaters in Shechita, it's a psul. If you had in mind wrong eaters in Zrika, there's no psul, because the Torah's halacha, where it taught me, that was we saw earlier, that wrong eaters is a psul, that is only said by Shechita, it's not said by Zrika. Now, according to Rav Chizda, Zrika is more chamer. Zrika is stricter than Shechita. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says, because the halacha of pigul is only finalized by Zrika. What's the Gemara meaning by this? As follows. Pigul is when you have in mind to eat a carbon in the wrong time. If you do any of the avodas with in mind that you could eat the meat in the wrong time, that's pigul, and the entire carbon is puzzle, and anybody who eats it gets kares. Now that's only true if there's no other psul in the carbon. If there's another psul in the carbon, it doesn't become pigul, it becomes that psul. So, when you do, let's say you have a pigul kavana at the time of shechita, you don't know if it's going to end up being pigul yet or not, because maybe there'll be a different psul in the Kabbalah, maybe there'll be a different psul in the halacha, maybe there'll be a different psul in the zrika. You only know that it's real pigul when all the four avodas are finished, the zrika has been done, and no other psulim are created. Either the rest was all kosher, or the rest was all pigul the same way. So Zrika is what finalizes the pigul status. Zrika is the only thing when you do the Zrika do you know that there's pigul here. So therefore Zrika is stricter than Shechita, and that's why it has a psul, even if it has only some people. You have in mind that only some of the people for the Zrika are elim, still it's a psul for everything. The Gemara now says Rav Ashi attacks this whole limud. He says, I don't understand this approach altogether. You're both assuming that when the Torah says v'chol orel, when it says v'chol orel lo yochol, by that means that it's only a psul if everybody there is an orel. Who said? Maybe it means v'chol orel if it's all an orel, meaning that if any orel that's involved is a psul, any one person. V'chol oral lo yochel, any oral, not all oral, any oral that's involved is a psul here, and that's what I would have thought by just reading those words. And therefore, the Brisa had to add vizos to teach me that halacha is only true if you have all orlos. That's what Zos is saying. It's got to be Zos. It has to be this thing. This entire shechita is all for orals. V'chol oral would have implied any oral is a problem, and it says all oral is an issue. That means any oral is an issue. When it says this zos chukas a Pesach, that's only if the entire Pesach is done l'shem arelim. That's where you have a psul. But there's no difference between shechita and zrika. Who said anything here about shechita and zrika? Where are you sticking in shechita and zrika? There's nothing to do with anything. So Rav Ashi says therefore a different shot, which we shall see in the next one.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethe.daf@gmail.com.